All right, let's open the file. We need to get straight to the situation report on this one. The indicators are, they're flashing red pretty much across the board.
Yeah, this is more than the usual diplomatic friction. We're not talking about a simple disagreement over, spending percentages. This goes much, much deeper.
It strikes right at the core of military cohesion, the trust between soldiers on the ground.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's establish the SI trap immediately. The who, what, and where. The primary actor is President Donald Trump. And in a very recent Fox News interview, he's publicly questioned whether NATO would, actually stand by the United States if the U.S. needed help.
But he didn't just leave it in the hypothetical, did he? He went backward.
He went straight for the historical record, specifically Afghanistan. I'm looking at the transcript, and the quote that's causing the firestorm is, "They only stood behind, far from the front lines."
And that's the specific claim. It's not a vague assertion. It's a direct accusation about combat performance.
He basically categorized the entire NATO contribution as, a rear echelon formality, not a real combat partnership.
And you can imagine the reaction. It was instantaneous. This isn't something diplomats can just smooth over behind closed doors. We saw immediate, very high-level rebuttals.
Primarily from the UK and Canada. The center of gravity for the fallout is definitely London. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's office. They issued a statement saying the assessment was factually wrong.
But the more telling reaction, I think, came from the UK Defense Secretary, John Healey.
That's one that caught my eye. It was more visceral. He had to go on record to, in essence, defend the honor of British service members.
And you have to remember the context here. This isn't happening in a vacuum. Starmer was already being very critical of Trump's proposed tariffs on the UK, so the atmosphere was already charged.
Which brings us to the operational reality. Let's move into the tactical deep dive, because statements are one thing, but the ledger of war is something else. I've been combing through the casualty data, trying to see if there's any merit at all to this claim of standing far from the front lines.
And it's a claim you can objectively test, right? The numbers exist.
They do, and the numbers are grimly clear. Look, let's just take the United Kingdom. Over 2 decades in Afghanistan, they sustained 457 soldiers killed in action. 457.
Right.
From an operational perspective, you just do not take 457 KIA by, standing in the back of the logistics tent. It doesn't happen.
No, you don't. And we should remind listeners where those casualties were happening. This wasn't Bagram Airfield. The British military was responsible for Helmand Province.
Exactly. Helmand. For anyone who doesn't know the terrain, that was the kinetic heart of the entire conflict. It was a Taliban stronghold, the center of the opium trade. It saw some of the most intense infantry combat since the Korean War.
We're talking house-to-house clearing, IEDs on a daily basis, constant ambushes.
So the idea that British Marines and paratroopers were standing behind anyone, it's just geographically and historically false.
And it wasn't just the British, of course.
Not at all. Look at Canada. 165 soldiers lost. For a military of their size, that's a staggering number. A generational trauma.
And you mentioned Denmark. The intelligence brief notes they had the highest casualty rate per capita of any nation in the coalition.
They did. These nations were patrolling, they were in firefights, and they were dying right alongside American soldiers and Marines.
Which brings up a profound irony in all of this. If we just zoom out for a second, strategically. Article 5.
The Collective Defense Clause.
It's only been invoked once in the entire history of NATO. Once.
September 12th, 2001.
Precisely. It was invoked for the defense of the United States, those 457 Brits, those 165 Canadians. They didn't die defending London or Ottawa. They died in a war that was triggered by an attack on New York and Washington.
Which is what makes the statement, "I'm not sure if NATO would stand by us," so jarring to anyone in the military establishment. I mean, the historical record shows they already did, and they paid for it in blood.
So that brings up the real question.
Exactly what I was thinking. The president has access to all this. He knows the KIA counts. So if the boots-on-the-ground argument is so easily statistically refutable, why say it? Is this just loose talk, or is there a function here?
That's the key. We have to look past the insult and find the strategic utility. And with this administration, things are rarely said by accident. This feels like a leverage play.
Okay, walk me through that. Because operationally, insulting your flank security seems like a bad way to win a fight. You want the person next to you to trust you.
Think of it as a debt, a moral debt. For 20 years, the U.S. has had this sort of implicit obligation to its allies because they bled in Afghanistan. It's a chip on the table in any negotiation. The British diplomat can always, implicitly say, "We were there for you."
So by denying they were really there, or at least downgrading their role to standing in the back, you're trying to wipe that debt off the ledger.
You're wiping it clean. It's a brute force negotiation tactic. If I can convince people your contribution was negligible, then I don't owe you anything. I don't owe you favorable trade terms. I don't owe you an exemption for my tariffs. It just clears the board for a purely transactional relationship.
And that lines up perfectly with the friction over tariffs. Prime Minister Starmer calls them a mistaken step, and almost immediately, the counterattack isn't on economics. It's on their military record.
It's the intersection of hard and soft power.
Yeah.
But, and this is a big but, I think it's a massive strategic error. There's a fine line between leverage and alienation.
A very fine line.
The UK is the most capable military partner the US has, period. They're nuclear armed, they have global intelligence reach through Five Eyes.
And you risk shattering that cohesion.
You risk degrading the trust that makes the entire machine work. When Secretary Healey said, "We always remember them with the greatest respect," that wasn't just a rebuttal. That was a signal of deep indignation. And if you lose the respect of the British military, you lose a force multiplier that no amount of money can buy.
Deterrence isn't just about hardware. It's about the belief that your allies will actually show up.
And that belief is being eroded.
You know, it's interesting you use the word indignation. We're seeing reports that British MPs, many of them veterans themselves, are calling the president out of touch with reality. That's a dangerous idea to let fester.
It is. It shifts the entire narrative from "our ally is a tough negotiator" to "our ally is an unreliable narrator of our own history."
And there was that other intel note, right? The one about the physical footprint. Reports that the U.S. is actively calculating a reduction of personnel at NATO headquarters.
Right, so this isn't just talk. There's planning for a physical drawdown happening alongside the rhetoric.
That takes it from the rhetorical to the logistical. It combines the words "you didn't help us"
Yeah.
with the action of literally removing staff. It just paints a picture of a transactional realignment.
And that's the most likely scenario, I think.
Let's explore that. If we look at the next 6 months, where does this trajectory lead?
Okay, I see 3 paths. Scenario 1, the most likely, is that transactional realignment. The U.S. pushes forward with the tariff threats. The insults about Afghanistan are basically a battering ram to force the UK and maybe the EU to accept bad trade terms in exchange for keeping the security guarantees.
So the nuclear umbrella stays up, but the rent just went up a lot.
Precisely. The message is, we'll protect you, but since you didn't really fight for us before, you need to pay us now. It's cynical, but it's a coherent strategy.
What about the worst case? We have that intel about the personnel reduction. If that happens, does the alliance even hold?
That's scenario 2, decoupling. If the rhetoric keeps escalating and the U.S. actually starts pulling command structures out of Europe, then the European nations might just decide the price of admission is too high. If they feel their blood sacrifice is not just unappreciated but actively denied, you could see a pivot.
Toward what?
Toward independent defense pacts. The UK and France leading a European security initiative, effectively fracturing the Atlantic alliance for good.
That makes the Atlantic Ocean seem a lot wider. But there was one other note, a quote where Trump claims to be the savior of NATO. How does that fit in?
That's our third scenario, the savior complex. It's all political theater for a domestic audience. He threatens to break the alliance, he insults the members, he terrifies the establishment, and then, when they offer some kind of concession, maybe a symbolic spending increase, he declares victory.
I fixed NATO, I saved it.
Exactly. He breaks the bone just so he can be the one to set it. It plays great at home, shows strength. But the danger, of course, is that you can't always set the bone perfectly. The scar tissue remains.
And that scar tissue is what worries me. I mean, we've talked about the past, but think about the future.
The next crisis.
Right, the next crisis. If the signal from Washington is that history is malleable, that past sacrifices are up for debate, it completely changes the calculus for any ally being asked to commit troops again.
It absolutely does. And the Greenland piece of this is fascinating.
Right, the intelligence note mentions Denmark. The U.S. wants to deploy troops to Greenland to counter Russia and China in the Arctic.
But Greenland is Danish territory. So on one hand, you're alienating the Danish government by dismissing their highest per capita sacrifice in Afghanistan, while simultaneously asking them for permission to garrison their most strategic territory.
You want the real estate, but you don't respect the landlord. It's a paradox.
It creates an impossible standard for loyalty. It destroys the entire concept of shared risk.
So to bring this all back to the site trip, we have a president challenging the historical reality of NATO combat. We have an infuriated British government Tariffs are on the horizon, and a potential staff drawdown at NATO HQ. The Atlantic rift seems to be widening by the day.
It is. And in a crisis, speed is everything. Trust is the lubricant for military alliances. If the gears are grinding because of this, that delay could be fatal.
You can't surge trust to the front lines like you can ammunition. It's either there or it isn't.
And right now, the tank is running very, very low.
It's going to be fascinating to watch how Prime Minister Starmer navigates this. Does he bow to the economic pressure to save the security relationship? Or does he have to stand his ground on the history?
I don't think he has a choice. Politically, no British prime minister can survive allowing the memory of their fallen to be insulted without a forceful response. This could be the rock the special relationship finally crashes on.
We'll have to keep monitoring the cables. But I want to leave our listeners with this one final thought. We've discussed the numbers: 457 British dead, 165 Canadians. We've talked about the only time Article 5 was ever invoked to protect the United States. If that contribution is now being dismissed as standing in the back, if that blood debt is now considered null and void,
Will anyone pick up the phone the next time the U.S. asks for help?
or will they decide that the cost of loyalty is simply too high and not worth the risk?
That is the question that should be keeping strategists in Washington awake at night.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. Stay informed.